The spring of 1945 brought a mixture of desperation and delusion to those Nazi leaders who still harbored fantasies of political survival. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsfuhrer SS, and one of the most powerful men in the crumbling Third Reich, sat in a commandeered villa near Hohenliken, north of Berlin, reviewing reports from intermediaries he had sent to contact Western Allied representatives. The responses he received shattered the elaborate edifice of self-deception he had constructed over the preceding months. Himmler had spent weeks developing what he considered a sophisticated political strategy. He believed that the Western Allies, Britain and America, would recognize that National Socialist Germany, despite its crimes and defeats, represented a bulwark against Soviet expansion. He imagined that the Western powers would prefer to negotiate with pragmatic Nazi leaders who could deliver German capitulation on the Western Front while continuing to fight the Soviets in the East. And he saw himself as the ideal intermediary for such negotiations, a man with authority second only to Hitler's, capable of delivering on promises that lesser officials could not guarantee. The Reichsfuhrer SS had authorized feelers through various channels. Count Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross had been approached with proposals for German surrender to the Western Allies while continuing the war against the Soviet Union. Other intermediaries had contacted Allied intelligence services with similar offers. Himmler had even ordered the release of some concentration camp prisoners to demonstrate his goodwill and willingness to moderate the regime's most extreme policies. But the responses that reached him through these various channels were uniformly and devastatingly negative. The Western Allies were not interested in negotiating with Himmler or any other Nazi leader. They were not interested in separate peace agreements that would allow Germany to continue fighting the Soviet Union. They demanded unconditional surrender to all Allied powers simultaneously. And they made clear that individuals responsible for war crimes and crimes of humanity, a category that unquestionably included Himmler, would face prosecution rather than political accommodation. Himmler read through the reports with growing agitation, his thin face betraying the stress that had accumulated over months of Germany's deteriorating military position. His hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as he held the papers. His eyes, magnified behind wire-rimmed glasses, moved across the text with an intensity that reflected his struggle to accept what he was reading. The Allies were not simply rejecting his specific proposals, they were rejecting the entire framework of assumptions on which those proposals were based. The Reichsfuhrer had convinced himself that his position as head of the SS, his control over the concentration camp system, his authority over the police apparatus made him valuable to the Western Allies. He imagined that they would see him as a necessary evil, a man with blood on his hands, but also with the power to deliver German compliance with Allied demands. He thought his willingness to negotiate demonstrated pragmatism that the Western powers would appreciate, especially when compared to Hitler's fanatical determination to fight to the last. But the Allied responses made clear that Himmler's control over the instruments of Nazi terror was not an asset but a liability. His role in organizing the Holocaust, in administering the concentration camp system, in directing the Einsatzgruppen that had murdered hundreds of thousands behind the Eastern Front, these were not credentials that made him a viable negotiating partner. They were crimes that guaranteed his eventual prosecution and likely execution. And the evidence against Himmler was overwhelming and undeniable. As Allied forces liberated concentration camps across Germany and Poland, they discovered documentation that traced the chain of command directly to the Reichsfuhrer SS. Orders bearing his signature authorized the construction of extermination facilities. Reports he had received detailed the numbers of Jews, Roma, Soviet prisoners, and others murdered under SS authority. His speeches to SS leaders, some of them recorded, acknowledged the extermination program and framed it as a difficult but necessary task. The physical evidence was equally damning. the gas chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the crematoria designed for industrial-scale murder, the warehouses filled with the belongings of the dead. All of this infrastructure had been built and operated under Himmler's command authority. The SS units that guarded these facilities, that operated the killing machinery, that disposed of bodies and managed the logistics of mass murder, all reported through chains of command that led ultimately to Himmler. Survivor testimony provided additional documentation of SS crimes. Concentration camp prisoners who had endured years of brutal treatment could identify SS officers, could describe the camp hierarchies, could recount the selection processes that sent some to forced labor and others to immediate execution. Witnesses to Einsatzgruppen massacres in occupied Soviet territory could describe how SS units rounded up Jewish populations and shot them into mass graves. The cumulative weight of this testimony was crushing. Allied intelligence services had been compiling evidence of Nazi war crimes throughout the conflict, preparing for the trials that would follow Germany's defeat. The documentation specifically related to Himmler filled entire files, orders he had signed, reports he had received, speeches he had delivered, organizational charts showing his command authority over the apparatus of genocide. This evidence made prosecution inevitable if he were captured alive. Himmler's aide, SS Obergruppenführer Karl Wolff, who had his own channels to Allied representatives through Operation Sunrise in Italy, reported that Western intelligence services viewed Himmler with particular revulsion. The Reichsfuhrer was not seen as a potential asset, but as one of the principal architects of Nazi crimes. Any association with him would be politically toxic for Allied leaders, who were already preparing for war crimes trials that would prosecute the Nazi leadership. The Reichsfuhrer struggled to understand how his calculations had gone so wrong. He had studied intelligence reports on Western public opinion, had read translations of American and British newspaper articles, had analyzed the political positions of Allied leaders. His conclusion had been that the West feared Soviet expansion more than they hated Nazi Germany, that they would ultimately prioritize containing communism over punishing German war criminals. This analysis was not entirely without foundation. Elements within Western intelligence and military circles did express concern about Soviet intentions, did worry about the post-war balance of power in Europe, did privately question whether the alliance with Stalin was wise in the long term. But Himmler had fatally misunderstood the difference between private concerns and public policy. Whatever worries Western leaders had about the Soviet Union, they were not prepared to compromise on the principle of unconditional surrender or to grant immunity to individuals responsible for the Holocaust. Himmler's intelligence on Western attitudes had been filtered through layers of SS bureaucracy, each layer adding its own distortions and wishful thinking. Reports that mentioned Western concerns about communism were emphasized, while reports about Allied determination to prosecute war criminals were minimized. Intelligence that contradicted Himmler's preferred conclusions was dismissed as propaganda or deception. The result was that the Reichsfuhrer operated with a fundamentally flawed understanding of Allied intentions. Moreover, Himmler had convinced himself that the Western powers were similar to himself in their willingness to subordinate moral considerations to political expediency. He believed that Allied leaders, like Nazi leaders, would ultimately make decisions based on power calculations rather than principles. This projection of his own mentality onto his enemies blinded him to the reality that the Western democracies, whatever their faults, had moral limits that Nazi Germany had systematically violated.